Hi, welcome to On the Fly, the show that takes you to local fly fishing destinations. I'm your host, Lee Smith. Many of us that fish for trout know about the conservation efforts of Trout Unlimited, and many of us are members. If you're unfamiliar, Trout Unlimited is an outdoor organization that's about 55 years old. TU works to keep our country's cold water fisheries and their watersheds safe from environmental threats for all of us to enjoy. TU is guided by the principle that if we take care of the fish, then the fishing will take care of itself. There are about 150,000 TU members and about 400 chapters nationwide. Over 30 chapters are in New York State. Tonight we have 4 guests from the Croton Watershed Trout Unlimited based in Pleasantville, New York. We have current president Harry Kerrigan, and then past presidents John Genovese and Bob Wesolowski, and also Dick Scordato. Gentlemen, thank you for coming on our show. John, would you start off by giving us the history of the Croton Watershed chapter?
Sure. Basically, it was started by somebody, if you're into fly fishing or fly tying, you'll recognize Dick Toulour's name, who actually was the first president back in 1971 time frame. He and Keith Fulcher, who was another older member, is a famous fly tyer as well, and both of them have been inducted into the Catskill Fly Fishing Hall of Fame. The chapter since then has it actually started in Somers, New York, which is right in the heart of the watershed, and has moved around and is now located in Pleasantville, where our meetings are.
Great, great. Bob, what does the chapter look like today as far as the members and the meetings and so forth?
At any given time, we generally have about 750 members. The distribution for the chapter goes from the Hudson River on the west to the Connecticut border on the east, from the New York City border in the south up to I-84 on the north. So it's a pretty substantial catchment that we have. And at any given time, we tend to have most of our members who come from 287 and above that.
Okay.
Guys below 287 tend to go to the New York City chapter meetings. All right.
Okay. And you have a monthly meeting?
We have 9 monthly meetings. Our meeting year goes from September through May. For many, many years, we've met on the 3rd Thursday of the month, and we meet at Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Pleasantville. And for those who know Pleasantville, we're just up the street from the Jacob Burns Theater.
Oh, very good, very good. Bob, tell me a little bit more. What are some of the major events that you have during the year as far as fishing trips, banquets, and so forth?
Okay. We have a pretty active social calendar. Most years we try to do 2 or 3 overnight trips. Those overnight trips are reserved for chapter members only. We try to go out to central Pennsylvania. We hit the Catskills. We also hit the Adirondacks on the overnight trips. And depending on the distance, those trips may go from Thursday to Sunday or from Friday to Sunday. We also have a number of day trips during the summer and fall where we'll go to the Catskill streams like the Beaverkill, we'll hit the Housatonic, and we'll also hit the Farmington rivers.
Right, that's pretty widespread.
It is.
That's great. And just generally, how many members join you for these types of outings?
For most of the overnight trips, we generally have a limitation of 15 to 18 anglers, and that's simply based on the number of accommodations that we can get in the inns and motels that we stay in. And we normally sell out pretty fast on the overnight trips. On the day trips, there's generally no limit on that, and we can get anywhere from 8 to 10 guys if it's during the week, all the way up to 20 or 25.
That's great. That's great participation.
Yeah, it really
is. Good deal. So, John, coming back to you, as a more or less a sponsor of the Croton Watershed, tell us more about the fishing there. I mean, the types of fish, the flies that you use, the best type of time of year to fish, if there is one, and especially because it is a watershed, maybe a little bit about the regulations as well.
Okay. Brought a map.
Great.
I just wanted to point out to the viewers that the watershed's pretty extensive. It starts up here on the East Branch at the Great Patterson Swamp and comes down through this angle here and joins up with the West Branch over here, and then they both drain into the New Croton Reservoir and then into the Hudson. And before it gets there, I marked 2 spots here where the aqueducts come from across the river in the Catskills. Here's the other one. That's where the water gets picked up and brought down into the city. So it's pretty extensive. The types of fish that we fish for in the streams tend to be trout. There are quite a few species, though. Some of when the water gets a little bit warm, some of the warm water species come up from the reservoirs. Bass, bluegill, and so on. But for the most part, the water stays cold enough to sustain the trout population. It does get up to maybe 70 degrees at the highest points of the summer months. Okay. The time that we fish really depends. The regulations are normally for the state April 1st through October 15th. However, there are some special regulations areas that cut off early, September 30th, for especially the spawning streams.
Okay.
And there's one that happens to be open all year long.
Oh, that's great.
So that keeps us busy through the winter months.
Okay, great. Tell me a bit more about the flies that you use.
Sure. I brought some from my fly box. Basically, the stream contains mayflies, caddisflies, and stoneflies. Okay. And midges, which are real tiny, on the order of a kind of a mini mayfly, and terrestrials. So let's start over here with the terrestrials. This is shown up there. Bugs such as ants and beetles. We also use some small streamers for imitating bait fish. And then the dry flies, adult flies that float on the surface, range from Hendrickson's, in the early part of the season through the lighter colored Cahill patterns and sulfurs, and intermittent throughout the fishing season are blue-wing olives, which are kind of standard. I always carry those. There are also caddisflies, which are these are the adult versions here. The water's pretty shallow, pretty thin, so I tend to use low riding patterns like comparadons and things of that nature. The Catskill patterns tend to be a little bit too bulky and high floating, and from my experience, I don't do as well with those. Okay. So I may use one in a real rough riffle just to be able to see it and have it float well enough to see. Underwater, which is where most of the feeding takes place, the caddis patterns here are basically, some people call them rockworms. They're the most prevalent in our area are green caddis larvae, and that's what these represent here. That happens to be my favorite pattern. It's more like an emerger. It's got some CDC on it. Then we have some of the midges, which this is a black zebra midge, which is pretty successful in the East Branch. Some of the other patterns, pheasant tails and hare's ears, are through this section here. Mm-hmm. Those are pretty standard and represent many different species, so they're good patterns to have. Right. And finally, the stoneflies over here, which there aren't many in the tailwaters per se. Some areas do have them, but Cross River Inlet, which is more of a freestone stream than a tailwater, we find quite a bit of stoneflies there through some of the work we do with trout in the classroom.
Great. And would you fish all of these year-round, or do some work better in certain seasons than others?
Well, the general rule is the flies start, and they're really cyclical. So you'll be able to kind of figure out the cycle, and the cycle usually starts with the darker patterns early in the season, and as the season progresses, they get lighter. So the Hendricksons and the black stoneflies we'll find early, like in March,
Okay.
in April, and then as the season goes on, some of the lighter patterns will be more successful.
Oh, that's great. I think we actually have a picture of you holding a fish. I believe so.
Oh,
That's nice. Tell us
Yeah.
about that.
That's a few years back, I'd say, a few pounds back. We were fishing in the East Branch at the time, right about this time of year, and going out west and fishing out there as well. This is one of my proudest fish, I'd say.
That's great.
Just that came out of the East Branch.
Great. Well, speaking of fish, John, tell me, do you help with the stocking at all?
Yeah, personally I do to some degree, but I still have a full-time job and can't get off to do much of that during the weekdays, which is when it happens. But some of our members, Harry, gets out. We've all been out occasionally, but we definitely help. The retired guys help most actively with coordinating with the DEC truck that comes down from the Catskills to stock the streams.
That's great. And I believe we have a picture of the shocking too. I think there's some participation with the
Yeah.
state shocking efforts. Maybe you could give us a little background on why you would shock the river in the first place
Okay.
and the chapter's involvement.
Sure. This is the West Branch of the Croton, which runs from Route 6 up between Carmel and Brewster, I guess, and goes down through to the Croton Falls Reservoir. And that section is not stocked at all. And what we rely on are the spawners that come out of Croton Falls Reservoir to come up and spawn. And that particular occasion, we pulled about 50 fish out, all brown trout, ranging in size from young of the year, and our largest that we netted was 20 inches.
That's great.
So they do reproduce. That section of the stream is well noted and in quite a bit of literature from our writer Nick Lyons, who mentions it quite a bit in his writings.
Oh, great, great. As long as I've been a member of Trout Unlimited, they've always been dedicated to improving education around rivers, fish, and fly fishing. Dick, could you tell us more about the Croton Watershed TU educational initiatives, such as Trout in the Classroom, and maybe give us a little idea about some of the recent activity?
Yeah. Trout in the Classroom is a program where students raise trout in their classrooms, as the program says. What happens is, matter of fact, most of the schools just started about 2 weeks ago. They pick up their eggs. There's a conference in Hyde Park, and most of the teachers go up there and pick up their eggs, and also share lesson plans, basically, on how do you grow or raise trout in your classroom. So during the course of the year, the students will raise a trout. They'll learn about raising trout, and the teachers have all kinds of lesson plans to tie in science and what's the pH of the water and what watersheds are all about, depending upon the age group. And then in the spring, they release trout. By this time, they should be little fingerlings
Sure.
into our local streams. And it's a great program, and lots of educational opportunities from schools from second grade all the way up to juniors and seniors in high school.
That's great. And do you know approximately how long the chapter's been involved with that program?
About 15 years.
That's great.
It's about 15 years.
Yeah.
And what we do is currently we sponsor 22 schools in the area. We provide the funding. Unfortunately, this equipment is kind of expensive because it's about $1,200 to set up a tank.
Okay.
Because you have to keep the water cold, so there's a chiller that's expensive. So we'll provide funding, and then we also help coordinate and provide a resource. Like, for example, I got an email this morning that one of the chillers broke, so we have to run around and try to help them get their tank cold before the little trout die.
Right. I think we've got some pictures too. I think there's 2 or 3. You have, I believe, a tank photo, right?
There's a tank, yeah.
And that's the standard setup?
Standard tank, usually about 50 gallons. There's a, in order to keep it's more difficult to keep a trout alive than say your normal home aquarium because you have to chill the water. It has to be around 55 degrees for the trout to live and thrive, and then it has to be filtered and processed, etc. So it's about $1,200 to get that equipment going.
Right. And I believe we also have a photo of one of your releases, I believe.
Yeah, so really a highlight for our chapters also is to attend the trout releases. So what will happen is the students or the teachers will make arrangements to go to a local stream, and the kids will release the trout, and it's a lot of fun. The kids often have the trout name, they sing songs, depending upon how old they are.
Great.
And we also support New York City schools. So we have 22 schools here in the local watershed. There are 75 schools or so in New York City that are also part of the program.
That's great.
But they need to be able to have a place to release trout. So most of them come up to Ward Pound Ridge Reservation and release. But in fact, last year we had somewhere close to 2,000 students up in Ward Pound Ridge.
That's great.
During the course of the season. So our members go out and help with these to coordinate. Harry was there a lot, I think the entire month of April and May. What we do is we go into the streams, we catch the macroinvertebrates, the living embodiments of the bugs that John was showing, and we bring them out and show them to the kids. And the kids get a big kick out of that,
Great.
to see the bugs, and we try to put the bugs back in the stream afterwards. And so there's a lot of coordinating to get all of that done.
I bet. I think we have one final photo, and I want to say it's of a cleanup.
Oh yeah. So one of the schools, actually right here in Mount Kisco in Fox Lane, they've been had a program for many years, and they release their trout into the Kisco River. And the teacher and the students just within the last, 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago?
Yeah, 2 or 3.
They went and they decided to do a cleanup for the stream where they always release the trout. So the kids went out on a Saturday
great.
and they had bags and bags of garbage, and they did a wonderful job. So it's another way to have the educational program, tie into this helping our watershed and our environment. So
That's great. No, great outreach too. Let me switch gears here. John and Bob, I know that you teach, the chapter teaches various classes. Could you tell us more about your fly fishing and fly tying schools? And John, I guess I'll start with you.
Okay. We have an 8-week program, and it's geared to beginners and people that might have fly fished years ago and are back actively pursuing it again. What we do is through the 8 weeks, we start in the classroom because it's usually inclement weather, in early March,
Sure.
and we end up going through teaching, what equipment looks like and what it's used for, how to rig up a rod with either nymphs or dry flies. We teach them knots. We also teach them entomology and show them the flies that they'll be using and what they imitate. And then we take them outside and get a little casting in, so they're get some idea of what that entails. And then we end up with the chapter taking out the students for a day on the water.
That's great.
Yeah, so it really is a nice program from start to finish.
That's great. Bob, what about the fly tying schools?
Well, like the fly fishing program, fly tying actually started about 35 years ago, and it's been going every year since. I think the timing of it is important in that we start every year in March and finish up in May. And the importance of that is that the guys get an opportunity to start to tie these patterns before the season starts, and so that they're ready with some of the basic stuff on opening day. The other thing that I've done is brought along what we can call the syllabus. I have the patterns that we tie from week 1 all the way through to week 8. And I think what we've tried to do is bring a clear methodology to the tying, in that at times when I've taken different fly tying classes, it seems to be hit or miss. You go from one pattern to another without an awful lot of rhyme or reason. And if you look at what we've done with the 8-week program, number 1, in week 1, we start at the bottom of the water column. By week 4 or 5, we're in the middle of the water column. And by week 8, we're at the top of the water column. So we work from the bottom to the top. That's number 1. I think the second thing that we've tried to do is get a lot of the classic patterns in there. We start with brassies and midges. We do pheasant tails, gold rib hare's ears. We do some woolly buggers. We do some soft hackles. And then up at the top, we do some caddis, some comparadons, and then we do some Adams. So we get the standard patterns in there, at least get an exposure. And then I think the final thing that we've tried to do with it is include a broad array of materials in here, so everybody gets exposure to those materials by the time they get out of the class.
That's great. We have just a couple of minutes left, and I want to talk to you about a couple of things that I know are close to the chapter. Harry, if I would, I'd like to hear just a little bit about Project Healing Waters and tell me about the chapter involvement. And then if we have just a minute or two, I'd like to talk about your guide to the fly fishing the Croton Watershed, if that's okay.
Okay, we were contacted by Tim Daly, the project coordinator for Project Healing Waters over at the Montrose VA hospital. We go over there 2 days a month, first and third Thursdays. We teach 2 classes each Thursday. One in the morning, one in the afternoon, and it's for the disabled vets. One class is fly tying, another class is rod making.
Okay.
One of the better things we do is take them on fishing trips.
Okay.
We've taken them out a few times. We do that in conjunction with Columbia Green TU, Mid-Hudson TU, and some of the other TUs.
Okay.
We take them up, they stay at the museum and in Livingston Manor, and we take them fishing for a couple of days.
That's
and
great.
They love it. They
That's
absolutely
wonderful.
love it.
That's great. We just have a minute or so to go. I wanted to basically, John, if I could ask you just to give us an overview of the book that you have available, A Fly Fisherman's Guide to Fishing the Croton Watershed.
Oh, sure. The map that I showed you earlier is in that guidebook, and we have it for sale on the website.
Okay.
And what it does is basically cover each of the sections. So here's the map. Just flip to one. Croton River, so you'll see exactly where
to
great. Fish. It's got access points on it. In the back of the book, there's also a hatch chart, and there's maps in as well as a separate map alongside. It's a pretty nice resource for people that want to fish the watershed. We sell quite a few, even to the city residents. It's really a short train ride to come up and get off in Croton Falls or Brewster, and you could be fishing and back down to the city for dinner and a show.
Nice, nice. Finally, Harry, as we wrap up here, because we're running out of time, can you tell me how to contact the chapter? I believe your website is www.cwctu.org. Would you like to add anything else to that?
Correct. Just that on the website, you'll see the chapter leaders, their areas of responsibility, and their websites, or their email addresses, rather. Just email any one of us, and
they'll get a response.
They'll get a response.
Great. Very good. I'd like to thank Harry, John, Bob, and Dick from the Croton Watershed chapter of Trout Unlimited. I'd like to thank the crew for making us look good, and thank you for watching On the Fly. Have a good evening.